Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we explore the plague. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. Before we can understand the plague, we must first journey back to a world vastly different from our own. A world where the very fabric of life hung by threads we couldn't yet see. The 14th century was a time of great movement and connection, though the people living through it could scarcely have imagined how these connections would reshape their world. Trade routes stretched like veins across continents, carrying silk and spices, ideas and innovations, and alongside these treasures, invisible passengers that would change the course of human history. The plague, as we know it, is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, named after Alexandre Yersin, who identified it in 1894. But this microscopic organism had been part of Earth's story for thousands of years before humans even gave it a name. It lived quietly in rodent populations across Central Asia, cycling through prairie dogs, marmots, and other small mammals, passed along by the fleas that fed upon them. In these animal communities, the bacterium found a stable home, neither completely destroying its hosts, nor disappearing entirely. It was a delicate balance that had persisted for millennia, largely unnoticed by the human world. The Silk Road was more than a single path. It was a network of routes connecting east and west, a web of commerce that had existed in various forms since ancient times. By the 13th and 14th centuries, this network had reached an unprecedented level of activity. The Mongol Empire, at its height, had created what historians sometimes call the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative stability that allowed merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers to travel vast distances with greater safety than ever before. Marco Polo's famous journeys occurred during this window of opportunity. Caravans moved steadily across deserts and mountains, stopping at caravanserais where travellers from distant lands mingled and traded stories along with goods. These trade routes passed directly through regions where Yersinia pestis lived in its animal reservoirs. Grain stores attracted rats, and rats travelled with the caravans. Fleas, tiny and easily overlooked, rode along in the fur of these rodents, and in the fabrics and goods being transported. When conditions were right, when rat populations grew dense and flea populations exploded, the bacterium could make the jump into new hosts with devastating efficiency. A flea carrying the plague bacteria would feed on a rat, and if that rat died, the flea would seek a new host, perhaps another rat, perhaps a human. The mechanics of this transmission were unknown to medieval people, but the results would soon become impossible to ignore. By the early 1300s, something was stirring in the East. Chinese records from this period mention unusual mortality and population disruptions, though the exact nature of these events remains debated by historians. What seems clear is that some kind of epidemic disease was moving, following the pathways humans had carved across the landscape. The Black Sea region, a crucial hub where Eastern and Mediterranean trade converged, would become a pivotal point in this story. Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, was a bustling port city where merchants from across the known world conducted business. In 1346, the city found itself under siege by a Mongol army. But the siege was cut short by something the attackers hadn't anticipated. Disease swept through their encampment, killing soldiers rapidly and mysteriously. According to one account by Gabriele de Musi, an Italian notary, the Mongol forces catapulted the bodies of their plague dead over the city walls before withdrawing. Whether this actually happened or is a dramatic embellishment remains uncertain, but what followed is historical fact. Genoese ships fled Kaffa, carrying refugees, cargo, and unwittingly the plague. These ships made port at Constantinople, then at various Italian cities including Messina, Genoa, and Venice. By the time harbour officials in some cities realised something was terribly wrong with the arriving vessels, it was already too late. Rats scurried down mooring ropes into new territories. Infected fleas found new hosts. The bacterium, having crossed thousands of miles, now entered Europe through its most connected and populous cities. From these port cities, the disease would radiate outward like ripples on water, following roads, rivers, and human settlements. The medieval world was not prepared for what came next. Medicine was based largely on the theories of ancient Greek physicians, particularly Galen, who had lived more than 1,000 years earlier. Disease was thought to arise from imbalances in the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or from miasmas, corrupted air arising from decay and filth. The idea that an invisible organism could pass from person to person, or from flea to person, existed nowhere in medieval medical understanding. Doctors, called physicians, had studied at universities where they learned to diagnose by examining urine, reading pulses, and consulting astrological charts. They were learned men, certainly, but their learning was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of disease transmission. So when the plague arrived in 1347 and 1348, spreading with terrifying speed through Italy, France, Spain, and beyond, the physicians of Europe were at a profound disadvantage. They could observe symptoms, the sudden fevers, the painful swellings called buboes that appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck, the dark spots on the skin that gave the disease its name, the Black Death. They could see that it killed quickly, often within days, but they couldn't see the cause, and without understanding the cause, they couldn't formulate effective treatments or preventative measures. The stage was set for one of the most significant catastrophes in human history, a catastrophe that would test every aspect of medieval society and leave changes that echo into our present day. The plague moved across Europe with a speed that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. In the spring and summer of 1348, it swept through France, reaching Paris by June. It crossed the Channel to England, arriving in the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset sometime in the early summer. By autumn, it had reached London. The German territory saw its arrival in 1348 and 1349, and by 1350 it had penetrated as far north as Scandinavia and as far east as Russia. No barrier seemed capable of stopping it. Mountains, rivers, political borders, all proved meaningless against this invisible invader. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague and wrote about it in the introduction to his Decameron, described how the disease seemed to pass from the sick to the healthy through mere proximity. He noted that it wasn't only humans who succumbed. Animals that came into contact with the belongings of plague victims often died as well. This observation was remarkably close to the truth, though Boccaccio couldn't have known about fleas or bacteria. What he and others recognised was that the disease had something to do with contact and proximity, even if the mechanism remained mysterious. The symptoms were horrifying and unmistakable. The bubonic form of plague, the most common variety, announced itself with sudden fever, chills, and weakness. Within a day or two, the characteristic buboes would appear, painful swellings of the lymph nodes where the body was attempting to fight off the bacterial invasion. These swellings could grow as large as eggs or apples, and they were excruciatingly tender. Some victims also developed dark patches on their skin, caused by bleeding under the surface, which gave the disease its most famous name. Death often came within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms, though some people lingered longer. and a fortunate few actually recovered. There were other forms as well. Pneumonic plague occurred when the bacteria infected the lungs, and this form could spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, much like influenza. It was even deadlier than the bubonic form, typically killing within 2 to 3 days, and it turned victims' sputum bloody. Septicemic plague, where the bacteria overwhelmed the bloodstream, was rarer but nearly always fatal. Medieval observers didn't distinguish between these forms scientifically, but they recognized that the disease manifested in different ways, and that some manifestations seemed even more lethal than others. The death toll was staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died during the initial outbreak between 1347 and 1353. In some communities, the mortality was even higher. Entire villages were abandoned. City populations were decimated. The English city of Bristol may have lost 40% of its people. Florence, with a pre-plague population of perhaps 100,000, was reduced to perhaps 50,000. These aren't mere statistics. Each number represented a mother, a father, a child, a craftsperson, a merchant, a farmer, someone whose absence created a hole in their family and community. The social fabric began to fray under this pressure. One of the most painful aspects of the plague was how it disrupted the normal rituals of death and mourning. Families often fled from their own sick members, terrified of contagion. Priests, who would normally administer last rites and provide spiritual comfort to the dying, sometimes refused to enter plague houses, or died themselves in such numbers that there weren't enough clergy to serve the living and the dying. Mass graves became necessary in many cities, as there was simply no way to provide individual burials for so many dead. In London, new cemeteries had to be consecrated to handle the overflow. The Smithfield Cemetery, blessed by the Bishop of London in 1349, received thousands of bodies in the space of months. Economic life was thrown into chaos. Fields went unploughed because there weren't enough labourers to work them. Harvests rotted because there was no one to bring them in. Shops closed because the proprietors had died. Trade networks that had taken centuries to establish broke down as merchants disappeared and towns closed their gates to outsiders. The price of labour shot up dramatically in the aftermath, as the survivors found themselves suddenly in demand. A peasant who had worked for meagre wages before the plague could now command 2 or 3 times as much, simply because there were so few workers left. This would have profound long-term consequences for European society, beginning to erode the rigid feudal structures that had defined the medieval world. Religious faith was tested in ways it had never been before. Many people interpreted the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins, a belief that seemed confirmed by the disease's terrible swiftness and its apparent disregard for virtue or innocence. Children died alongside adults. The pious perished as readily as the sinful. Some turned to intense religious devotion, forming processions of flagellants who whipped themselves publicly, hoping to appease God's wrath. Others questioned their faith more deeply, wondering what kind of God would allow such suffering. The church itself was weakened, both by the deaths of so many clergy and by its obvious inability to stop or explain the catastrophe. Yet even in this darkest time, we can see the seeds of change that would eventually lead to progress. The plague forced people to observe and question in new ways. Why did some people survive while others died? Did certain actions seem to offer protection? The answers they arrived at were often wrong by our standards, but the act of questioning, of trying to find patterns and causes, was itself valuable. Medieval people began to notice that fleeing infected areas sometimes worked, that isolation seemed to help, that perhaps the sick should be separated from the healthy. These observations, born of desperate necessity, would eventually evolve into more sophisticated public health measures. As the plague raged through Europe, people desperately sought ways to protect themselves and their loved ones. Without understanding the true nature of disease transmission, their methods were based on the medical theories of the time, on folklore, on observation, and sometimes on sheer desperation. Some of these methods were completely ineffective, some were harmful, and a few, quite by accident, actually helped reduce transmission. Looking back at these attempts with our modern knowledge creates a strange mixture of compassion for their predicament and recognition of how far medical science has advanced. The miasma theory, the belief that disease arose from corrupted air, dominated medieval medical thinking. If bad air caused plague, then logic suggested that good smells might protect against it. People carried pomanders, small perforated containers filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, or dried flowers. Physicians stuffed the beaks of their distinctive plague doctor masks with herbs, spices, and fragrant materials, believing this would filter the poisoned air. They carried canes to examine patients from a distance and wore long waxed coats. While the sweet smells did nothing to stop bacteria, the mask and the distance they maintained from patients may have offered some minimal protection against pneumonic plague, though not for the reasons they believed. Burning fragrant woods and herbs was another common practice. Juniper, rosemary, and other aromatic plants were set alight in homes and public spaces, filling rooms with smoke that was supposed to cleanse the air. Some cities maintained public bonfires for this purpose. Vinegar was thought to have special protective properties, and people would wash their hands and faces with it, sprinkle it on letters and coins, even consume it mixed with other substances. Interestingly, while vinegar couldn't kill plague bacteria on contact, the habit of washing with anything might have removed some contaminated material, providing a tiny degree of benefit. Bloodletting was a standard medical treatment for almost any ailment in medieval times, and physicians applied it liberally to plague patients. The theory held that removing blood would help rebalance the humours and expel the poison causing the disease. In reality, of course, it only weakened patients who were already fighting a severe bacterial infection. Similarly, attempts to lance or drain the buboes, while sometimes providing temporary pain relief, often introduced additional infections. Medieval surgery was performed without any concept of sterility, and surgical instruments could themselves become vectors for spreading bacteria. Some people turned to theriac, an ancient medicinal compound that supposedly contained dozens of ingredients, sometimes including viper flesh, opium, and various herbs and spices. The exact recipe varied, but theriac was considered a universal antidote to poison and disease. It was expensive, putting it beyond the reach of common people, and of course it was entirely ineffective against plague. The wealthy who could afford such remedies died just as readily as the poor, a fact that did not go unnoticed and contributed to social tensions. Dietary advice was also abundant. Physicians recommended avoiding certain foods thought to corrupt the humours or generate bad vapours. Fish, fruit and vegetables were often viewed with suspicion, while some advised eating only boiled or roasted foods. Wine, preferably mixed with spices, was considered safer than water. Some of these recommendations, particularly the preference for boiled or well-cooked food, may have offered minor benefits by reducing exposure to other pathogens, though not plague itself. The advice against fruit and vegetables, however, would have deprived people of valuable nutrients at a time when their bodies needed all the strength they could muster. Flight was perhaps the most effective strategy available, though only to those with the means to employ it. The wealthy could retreat to country estates, taking their households with them and minimizing contact with the infected urban populations. This worked because it reduced exposure to sick individuals and to the rat and flea populations that were densest in cities. The Latin phrase that summed up this strategy was cito, longe, tarde, meaning leave quickly, go far away, and return slowly. It was practical advice, but it was advice that only the privileged could follow. The poor, tied to their land or their urban occupations, had no such option. Some cities began experimenting with quarantine measures, though the concept was not yet fully developed. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days, the period that ships were sometimes required to wait before passengers and cargo could disembark. Venice implemented such measures in 1348, requiring incoming ships to anchor off the coast for a period before being allowed into the harbour. Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, developed similar policies. These were among the first systematic attempts at disease control through isolation, and while imperfectly understood and inconsistently applied, they represented a crucial insight. Keeping the sick away from the healthy could slow the spread of disease. On a household level, some families isolated their sick members in separate rooms or even separate buildings when possible. They burned or buried the belongings of the deceased, instinctively recognizing that something about these objects posed a danger. Again, while they couldn't have known about bacteria or fleas, they were observing that the disease seemed to cling to things as well as people. This led to practical, if not scientifically grounded, precautions that sometimes helped. Religious measures were widespread. Beyond the flagellants, who believed that physical punishment might atone for collective sin, people flocked to churches for special masses and prayers. Saints associated with healing were invoked, particularly Saint Sebastian and Saint Roche, who became patron saints of plague sufferers. Pilgrimages were undertaken, though these gatherings of people likely spread the disease further. The faithful believed that divine intervention was their best hope, and in the absence of effective medical treatment, this belief provided psychological comfort even if it offered no physical protection. Perhaps most tragically, the plague gave rise to scapegoating and violence. In many parts of Europe, Jewish communities were blamed for the plague, accused of poisoning wells or practicing dark magic. These accusations were baseless, and medieval authorities, including Pope Clement VI, attempted to dispel them, pointing out that Jews were dying of plague just like Christians. But fear and prejudice proved stronger than reason, and terrible pogroms occurred, particularly in German territories, where entire Jewish communities were massacred. This dark chapter reminds us that epidemics do not only cause physical harm, they can unleash the worst aspects of human nature when fear overrides compassion and rationality. The Black Death did not end in 1350. Although the initial wave had passed, leaving Europe's population devastated and its societies transformed, the plague itself had not disappeared. It had merely settled into a new pattern, one that would persist for centuries. The bacterium Yersinia pestis had found permanent homes in European rodent populations, creating reservoirs from which new outbreaks could emerge. Understanding this longer history helps us see how the plague shaped not just a single generation, but the entire trajectory of European civilization. The second plague pandemic, as historians call this long period, saw waves of plague return again and again. Major outbreaks occurred in 1361 through 1363, in 1369 through 1371, and then at irregular intervals throughout the following centuries. Each successive outbreak was generally less severe than the initial Black Death, partly because the population was now smaller and more dispersed, and partly because those with some genetic resistance had survived the earlier waves and passed this advantage to their children. But these later outbreaks were still deadly, still disruptive, still terrifying. London in particular experienced plague repeatedly. The city saw significant outbreaks in 1469, 1513, 1543, 1563, 1592, 1563, 1593, 1594, and most famously, in 1665. The Great Plague of London, as the 1665 outbreak became known, killed an estimated 100,000 people, roughly a quarter of the city's population at the time. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded his observations of the plague year, describing empty streets, the constant ringing of death bells, and the red crosses painted on the doors of infected houses with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Italy continued to suffer as well. Milan experienced a severe outbreak from 1576 to 1577, which inspired the construction of the Lazaretto of Milan, a large quarantine facility. Venice saw major plague years in 1575 through 1577, and again from 1630 to 1631. This latter outbreak killed approximately 46,000 people in Venice alone, nearly a third of the city's population. The magnificent church of Santa Maria della Salute, one of Venice's most recognizable landmarks, was built as a votive offering in gratitude for the city's eventual deliverance from this plague. France suffered recurring outbreaks as well. Marseille experienced a devastating plague in 1620 through 1621, and then again, remarkably late in the plague's European history, in 1720 through 1722. This last great outbreak of plague in Western Europe killed up to 100,000 people in Provence, and demonstrated that even after centuries of experience, societies remained vulnerable. The 1720 Marseille plague prompted one of history's first organised medical responses, with physicians and officials implementing strict quarantine measures, cordoning off entire neighbourhoods, and attempting to control the movement of people and goods. Between these major urban outbreaks, plague persisted at a lower level in rural areas and smaller towns. It would flare up, kill dozens or hundreds, then subside again. This pattern of endemic plague, punctuated by epidemic outbreaks, became a fact of life. Families knew to watch for the symptoms. Cities maintained plague hospitals and burial grounds. Governments developed increasingly sophisticated quarantine regulations. The plague had become woven into the fabric of European life in a way that seems almost incomprehensible to us now. The psychological impact of living under this recurring threat was profound. People in the 16th and 17th centuries grew up knowing that plague could return at any time. It influenced literature, art, philosophy, and religion. The dance of death, or danse macabre, became a common artistic motif, depicting death as a skeletal figure leading people of all social classes in a dance, a reminder that death comes to everyone regardless of wealth or status. This memento mori tradition, the meditation on mortality, pervaded European culture during these centuries. The economic and social changes that began with the Black Death continued to develop. The labour shortage persisted, giving workers continued leverage to demand better conditions. Serfdom, which had been declining before the plague, eroded more rapidly afterward. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was partly driven by attempts to roll back the gains workers had made in the post-plague labour market. Although the revolt was suppressed, the long-term trend toward more free labour and away from feudal obligations continued. The plague, by killing so many, had paradoxically improved the economic situation of those who survived. Urban planning began to change in response to plague. Cities that had grown organically during the Middle Ages, with narrow, crowded streets and buildings packed tightly together, began to consider wider streets, better drainage, and less crowded living conditions. While the true mechanisms of plague transmission remained unknown, authorities recognized that crowded, filthy conditions seemed to correlate with worse outbreaks. London's Great Fire of 1666, which occurred just a year after the Great Plague, provided an opportunity to rebuild parts of the city with these considerations in mind, though financial constraints meant that many areas were simply rebuilt in their old patterns. Medical understanding evolved slowly during these centuries. The humoral theory remained dominant, but physicians accumulated more detailed observations of plague symptoms and progression. Some began to question whether the miasma theory fully explained transmission patterns. Girolamo Fracastoro, an Italian physician of the 16th century, proposed that diseases might be transmitted by tiny seed-like particles called seminaria, which could spread through direct contact, contaminated objects, or through the air. This was remarkably prescient, though Fracastoro's theory was not widely accepted, and he lacked the technology to prove his hypothesis. Quarantine practices became more systematic and sophisticated. Lazarettos, specialized plague hospitals located outside city walls, were established in many Italian cities. Ships arriving from plague-affected regions were required to wait at designated anchorages before receiving permission to dock. Goods were fumigated or aired out. Health passes were issued to travellers, certifying that they came from plague-free areas. These measures were imperfect and often circumvented, but they represented a growing understanding that isolating the sick and controlling movement could limit disease spread. The foundations of public health were being laid, built on centuries of bitter experience with plague. By the late 18th century, something remarkable was happening. Plague outbreaks in Western Europe became less frequent, less severe, and eventually stopped altogether. The last major outbreak in Western Europe was the Marseille Plague of 1720 through 1722. After that, while plague continued to circulate in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, it seemed to have loosened its grip on Europe. Understanding why this happened requires us to look at a constellation of changes, some deliberate and some accidental, that together created conditions less favourable for the plague bacterium. One significant factor was the gradual improvement in housing and urban sanitation. European cities in the 18th century were still far from clean by modern standards, but they were considerably better than their medieval counterparts. Buildings were increasingly constructed of brick and stone rather than timber and thatch, providing fewer harbouring places for rats. Streets were slowly being paved and widened. Drainage systems were being improved, reducing the standing water and filth that attracted vermin. These changes were not motivated primarily by understanding of disease transmission. They were part of broader efforts at urban improvement and modernisation, but they had the unintended effect of reducing rat populations in human living spaces. The Great Fire of London in 1666, despite being a catastrophe, had one beneficial long-term effect. The rebuilding that followed created a city with more stone and brick construction, wider streets, and better organisation. Similar patterns of reconstruction after fires or deliberate urban renewal projects in other European cities had comparable effects. Medieval wooden cities, so hospitable to rats, were gradually being replaced by more rat-resistant urban environments. Changes in ship construction and trade patterns also played a role. As sailing ships became larger and more sophisticated, their design inadvertently made them somewhat less hospitable to rats. The replacement of wooden ships with iron hulls in the 19th century would make an even greater difference, but the transition was already beginning in the 18th century with improved ship design and maintenance. Maritime quarantine procedures had also become more effective and more widely enforced. Ports had centuries of experience in dealing with plague by this point, and they had developed reasonably effective protocols for inspecting ships and isolating potentially infected vessels and cargo. A fascinating and somewhat controversial theory involves changes in rat populations themselves. The black rat, Rattus rattus, which had been the dominant commensal rat in Europe during the Middle Ages, was gradually being displaced by the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. The brown rat began spreading across Europe in the early 18th century, arriving from Central Asia via Russia. Brown rats are larger and more aggressive than black rats, and they tend to displace them in urban environments. Importantly, brown rats prefer to live in burrows and sewers, spending less time in the upper stories of buildings where humans sleep. This meant less direct contact between rats and humans, and potentially less opportunity for fleas to transfer from rats to people. While this theory remains debated among historians and biologists, it offers an intriguing explanation for why plague declined, just as the brown rat was spreading across Europe. Climate may have played a role as well. The period from roughly the 14th through the 19th centuries is sometimes called the Little Ice Age, a time of generally cooler temperatures in Europe. Within this longer cooling trend, there were fluctuations, and some researchers have suggested that certain temperature and humidity conditions might have affected flea populations or the efficiency of plague transmission. However, this remains speculative, and the relationship between climate and plague dynamics is complex and not fully understood. Public health measures, while based on incomplete understanding, had become more sophisticated and more consistently applied. By the 18th century, European states had developed bureaucracies capable of organising responses to disease threats. Quarantine was no longer just a local measure, but was coordinated across regions. Bills of mortality, regular reports of deaths by cause, helped authorities track disease and respond to emerging outbreaks. Plague hospitals and isolation facilities existed in major cities. While these measures couldn't eliminate plague, they could contain outbreaks more effectively, preventing small clusters of cases from becoming major epidemics. There may also have been evolutionary changes in the plague bacterium itself, or in human resistance to it. Some scientists have hypothesized that the plague strains circulating in later centuries might have been somewhat less virulent than those of the Black Death, though genetic evidence for this is limited. On the human side, centuries of exposure to plague would have exerted strong selective pressure, favouring individuals with genetic variants that conferred some resistance. This doesn't mean humans became immune, but populations that had experienced multiple plague epidemics might have had a slightly higher proportion of people who could survive infection, or who were less likely to contract it in the first place. The convergence of all these factors, improved urban conditions, better quarantine practices, changes in rat ecology, possible evolutionary changes, and perhaps some luck with climate and bacterial strains, created conditions where plague could no longer sustain itself in Western Europe. It's important to note that no single factor eliminated the plague. Rather, it was the accumulation of many small changes, most of them not specifically targeted at plague, that together made Europe an inhospitable environment for epidemic plague. Yet plague itself had not disappeared from the world. It continued to cause outbreaks in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The third plague pandemic, which began in China in the mid-19th century, would eventually spread to all inhabited continents, reaching San Francisco, Sydney, and ports across the globe. This pandemic, though less deadly than the Black Death in terms of total mortality, would persist well into the 20th century and would finally lead to the scientific breakthroughs that revealed the true nature of plague. The disease that had shaped European history for 4 centuries had become, by the 19th century, primarily a problem for other parts of the world, but it remained very much a problem, and one that would require modern science to finally understand and control. The 19th century brought transformations that would forever change humanity's relationship with infectious disease. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping societies, creating new cities and new ways of living, but it was also creating new tools and new ways of thinking. Science was becoming more systematic, more experimental, and more willing to challenge ancient assumptions. The stage was set for breakthroughs that would finally reveal the true nature of plague and offer the possibility of control. But first, plague itself would make a dramatic return on a global scale, reminding the world that this ancient enemy was far from defeated. In 1855, plague erupted in Yunnan province in southwestern China. This outbreak marked the beginning of what historians call the Third Plague Pandemic, distinguishing it from the Justinianic plague of the 6th and 7th centuries and the Black Death pandemic that began in the 14th century. The Yunnan outbreak spread through China over the following decades, moving along trade routes and rivers, reaching the coast and the great port cities. By 1894, it had arrived in Hong Kong, then one of the most important trading hubs in Asia. Hong Kong in 1894 was a densely populated city with a large population living in crowded conditions. When plague arrived, it spread rapidly through the poorest neighbourhoods. The colonial authorities, British officials governing this Chinese city, found themselves facing a disease they had only read about in history books. Plague had been absent from Britain for nearly 2 centuries, and the doctors and officials in Hong Kong had no direct experience with it. They did, however, have something their predecessors had lacked: the tools and methods of modern microbiology. 2 scientists arrived in Hong Kong within days of each other in June of 1894, both determined to identify the cause of plague. Shibasaburo Kitasato was a Japanese bacteriologist who had studied with Robert Koch, one of the founders of modern microbiology. Alexandre Yersin was a Swiss-French bacteriologist working for the Pasteur Institute in Paris. Both men set up makeshift laboratories and began examining tissue samples from plague victims. The race was on to identify the causative agent of one of history's most feared diseases. Kitasato announced his findings first, claiming to have isolated the plague bacterium. However, his identification was later shown to be incorrect. He had actually isolated a different bacterium that was present in the samples, but not the cause of plague. Yersin, working in more difficult conditions with less support, made careful observations and meticulous notes. He isolated a bacterium from the buboes of plague victims and from the organs of dead rats found near plague cases. He noted the abundance of dead rats and made the crucial connection that rats might be involved in plague transmission. His careful work and accurate identification earned him the honour of having the bacterium named after him, Yersinia pestis. The discovery of the bacterium was a monumental achievement, but it didn't immediately explain how the disease spread. That mystery was solved a few years later by Paul Louis Simond, another researcher from the Pasteur Institute working in India. In 1898, Simond demonstrated that fleas were the vector that transmitted plague bacteria from rats to humans. He conducted experiments showing that uninfected rats could contract plague from infected rats only when fleas were present. This was the missing piece of the puzzle, the explanation for why plague seemed to spread in patterns that involved both rats and humans, and why eliminating rats from ships and buildings could help prevent plague. These discoveries vindicated some of the old quarantine practices. Isolation and barrier methods had worked, not because they prevented bad air from spreading, but because they prevented infected fleas and rats from reaching new populations. At the same time, the discoveries revealed how wrong medieval physicians had been about the fundamental mechanisms. There were no imbalances of humours, no miasmas poisoning the air. Instead, there was a microscopic organism transmitted by an insect living in rodent populations. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more complex than anyone had imagined. Armed with this new understanding, public health officials could develop more effective control measures. Rat control programs were implemented in ports and cities affected by plague. Ships were fumigated to kill rats and fleas. Areas with active plague were treated to reduce rodent populations. People in plague-affected regions were educated about the importance of avoiding contact with sick or dead rodents and about protecting themselves from flea bites. These measures, while not perfect, were far more effective than anything that had been tried in previous centuries. The third pandemic spread from China to India, where it caused millions of deaths over several decades. It reached Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Australia, and both American continents. San Francisco experienced plague in 1900 through 1904, marking the disease's arrival on the American mainland. The outbreak was initially denied by city officials who feared the economic impact of a plague diagnosis, but eventually had to be acknowledged and addressed. Small outbreaks occurred in various American cities over the following decades, and plague became established in rodent populations in the American Southwest, where it persists to this day in prairie dog colonies. Despite its global reach, the third pandemic never achieved the mortality rates of the Black Death. Partly this was because of the public health measures now available. Partly it was because medical care, even before antibiotics, had improved enough to save some patients who would previously have died. And partly it was because the strains involved in the third pandemic, while deadly, may have been somewhat less virulent than those of the medieval period. Nevertheless, the third pandemic claimed millions of lives, primarily in Asia, and demonstrated that plague remained a formidable threat. The scientific understanding of plague opened the door to even more important developments: the creation of vaccines and eventually the discovery of antibiotics. In 1897, Waldemar Haffkine developed the first plague vaccine, which he tested on himself before using it on others. While not perfectly effective, it offered some protection and was used widely in India during plague outbreaks. The development of this vaccine represented a triumph of the new scientific approach to disease, using knowledge of the causative organism to stimulate the body's own defences. The 20th century brought the final tools needed to truly control plague: antibiotics. The discovery and development of these remarkable drugs represents one of the greatest achievements in medical history, and their impact on plague cannot be overstated. What had been a near-certain death sentence for most of human history became, quite suddenly, a treatable condition. Yet the story of how we arrived at this point is as much about luck and persistence as it is about scientific brilliance, and the journey reminds us that medical progress is rarely straightforward. Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin in 1928 is one of the most famous stories in science. Returning from vacation, Fleming noticed that a petri dish containing Staphylococcus bacteria had been contaminated by mold, and around the mold, the bacteria had died. The mold, a penicillium species, was producing a substance that killed bacteria. Fleming recognized the potential importance of this observation and published his findings, but he struggled to purify and produce penicillin in quantities that could be used as medicine. The substance seemed promising, but turning that promise into practical treatment would require more than a decade of additional work. It was Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain, working at Oxford University in the late 1930s and early 1940s, who developed methods to purify and mass-produce penicillin. The outbreak of World War II provided both urgency and resources for this work. Wounded soldiers were dying of bacterial infections, and an effective antibiotic could save countless lives. By 1942, penicillin was being produced in sufficient quantities for clinical trials, and by 1943, it was being manufactured on a large scale. The results were dramatic. Infections that had routinely killed now could be cured with a course of injections. Penicillin didn't work against all bacteria, but it worked against many important ones. For plague specifically, penicillin was not the first antibiotic solution. Streptomycin, discovered by Albert Schatz and Salman Waxman in 1943, proved to be more effective against Yersinia pestis. Streptomycin was an aminoglycoside antibiotic, different in structure and mechanism from penicillin, and it worked well against the plague bacterium. Clinical trials in the 1940s demonstrated that streptomycin could cure plague patients, even those with the pneumonic form that had previously been almost universally fatal. The mortality rate for treated plague cases dropped from over 90% to less than 15%, and with early treatment could be brought down even further. Other antibiotics soon followed. Tetracyclines, chloramphenicol, and eventually fluoroquinolones all proved effective against plague. Doctors now had multiple options for treatment, which was important because different antibiotics had different side effects, and some patients couldn't tolerate certain drugs. The availability of multiple effective treatments meant that plague, while still serious, had become a manageable disease rather than an existential threat. The impact of antibiotics on plague cannot be separated from their broader impact on infectious disease. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, sepsis, and countless other bacterial infections became treatable. Child mortality dropped dramatically as infections that had routinely killed infants and children could now be cured. Life expectancy increased significantly in countries where antibiotics became widely available. We had entered what some called the antibiotic age, a period when it seemed that humanity might finally conquer infectious disease. This optimism, however, proved premature. Even as antibiotics were transforming medicine, bacteria were evolving resistance to them. This is a fundamental principle of evolution. When a population faces selective pressure, variants that can survive that pressure will proliferate. Some bacteria possessed or developed genetic variations that allowed them to survive exposure to antibiotics, and these resistant bacteria would multiply while susceptible bacteria died off. By the 1960s and 70s, antibiotic-resistant strains of various bacteria were becoming a recognized problem. For plague specifically, antibiotic resistance has remained relatively rare, which is fortunate given the disease's severity. However, cases of multi-drug resistant plague have been documented, primarily in Madagascar. These resistant strains are still treatable with alternative antibiotics, but their existence is a reminder that we cannot become complacent. The bacterium that causes plague is capable of evolving, just like any other organism, and overuse or misuse of antibiotics could potentially create strains that are much harder to treat. The development of antibiotics also changed how public health authorities approach plague control. In the pre-antibiotic era, the focus was almost entirely on prevention, controlling rat populations, enforcing quarantines, and avoiding exposure. These measures remain important, but now treatment of infected individuals is also a powerful tool. When cases are identified quickly and treated promptly, not only can those individuals be saved, but the chance of them spreading the disease to others is greatly reduced. This is particularly important for pneumonic plague, which can spread directly from person to person and therefore poses a risk of rapid epidemic spread. Modern plague control thus combines multiple approaches. Surveillance systems monitor for plague activity in animal populations and quickly identify human cases. Public education in areas where plague is endemic teaches people to avoid contact with sick or dead rodents, to use flea control on their pets, and to seek medical care immediately if they develop symptoms. When cases occur, patients are isolated and treated, while health workers trace contacts and offer prophylactic antibiotics to those who may have been exposed. Veterinary medicine also plays a role, treating plague in domestic animals and monitoring wildlife populations. The World Health Organization maintains guidelines for plague prevention and control, and countries with endemic plague have developed expertise in managing the disease. The United States, for example, sees a handful of plague cases each year, primarily in rural areas of the Southwest, where the bacterium persists in rodent populations. These cases are treated quickly and rarely lead to further spread. Madagascar, which has more plague cases than anywhere else in the world, has developed systems for rapid response to outbreaks, though resource constraints and the challenges of reaching remote rural populations complicate control efforts. The story of antibiotics and plague illustrates a broader truth about our relationship with infectious disease. Scientific advances give us powerful tools, but they don't provide permanent solutions. Bacteria evolve, circumstances change, and vigilance remains necessary. The plague has not been eradicated, and given that it persists in animal reservoirs around the world, complete eradication is probably impossible. But it has been transformed from a civilization-threatening pandemic disease into a rare and treatable infection, and that transformation represents genuine progress. Understanding how plague has shaped modern society requires us to look beyond the immediate medical and public health advances. The centuries of plague epidemics left marks on our institutions, our culture, our psychology, and even our genes. These influences are sometimes subtle, woven so deeply into the fabric of our world that we hardly recognize them as legacy of disease. Yet when we examine the structures and systems that organize modern life, we find again and again that plague played a role in their development. Public health as an organized discipline traces much of its foundation to plague control efforts. The quarantine systems developed in medieval and early modern Europe were among the first examples of governments taking systematic coordinated action to protect population health. The bills of mortality that English parishes began keeping in the 16th century, partly to track plague deaths, evolved into the vital statistics systems that modern governments maintain. The idea that the state has a responsibility to monitor disease, to isolate the sick, to control epidemics, and to protect the health of populations, these concepts were forged in the crucible of plague experience. The notion of cordons sanitaires, creating boundaries that people cannot cross during epidemics, came directly from plague control efforts. So did the practice of disease surveillance, the systematic collection of information about where disease is occurring and how it's spreading. Contact tracing, now familiar to many people due to recent epidemics, has roots in plague control measures. Health certificates for travellers, requirements for ships to report illness, the establishment of quarantine facilities, all of these practices that we now take for granted in international health regulations began as responses to plague. Urban planning and architecture bear plague's influence as well. The movement toward wider streets, better sanitation, and less crowded housing conditions was motivated partly by experiences with epidemic disease. While reformers in the 19th and 20th centuries were concerned with many diseases, not just plague, the historical memory of plague epidemics informed their understanding that crowded, unsanitary conditions facilitated disease transmission. The public health movements that led to improved water supplies, sewage systems, and housing standards were building on lessons learned over centuries of plague experience. Hospitals, too, evolved partly in response to plague. Medieval hospitals were often charitable institutions run by religious orders, providing shelter and care, but little effective medical treatment. The lazarettos and plague hospitals of the Renaissance era were different, specialized facilities designed specifically to isolate the sick and prevent disease spread. These institutions helped establish the principle that hospitals should be organised to serve medical purposes, not just charitable ones, and that isolation of infectious patients is an important function of medical facilities. Modern infectious disease hospitals and isolation wards are descendants of these plague-era innovations. The scientific method itself, while not created by plague, was certainly sharpened by it. The failure of traditional theories to explain or control plague encouraged some thinkers to question received wisdom and to look for new explanations based on observation and experiment. The long struggle to understand plague helped demonstrate the value of systematic observation, careful record-keeping, and experimental testing. When Yersin and others finally identified the plague bacterium, they were using methods that had been developed over centuries of scientific progress, but the urgency provided by epidemic disease had been one of the forces driving that progress. Economically, plague's effects rippled through centuries. The labour shortages that followed the Black Death contributed to the end of feudalism and the rise of more flexible labour markets. Workers who could demand higher wages had more resources to invest, to consume, and to improve their situations. Some historians argue that the post-plague labour shortages contributed to Europe's eventual economic development and the Industrial Revolution by creating incentives for labour-saving innovations. When labour is scarce and expensive, there's a strong motivation to develop tools and machines that can do work more efficiently. The plague also influenced the development of insurance and actuarial science. The need to assess risk, to calculate the probability of death, and to create financial instruments that could provide security in an uncertain world. These needs became more pressing in societies that had experienced devastating epidemics. Life insurance and annuities developed partly in response to the recognition that death could strike unpredictably, and that families needed ways to protect themselves financially. Culturally, plague left deep marks. The artistic preoccupation with mortality that emerged during and after the Black Death never entirely disappeared. The tradition of memento mori, reminding oneself of death, influenced European art and literature for centuries. The themes of universal mortality, of death as the great equalizer, of the fragility of human life, these became woven into Western cultural consciousness. Even today, when plague is no longer a major threat in most of the world, these themes remain powerful in art and literature. Language itself preserves memories of plague. We still use the word quarantine, derived from the 40-day isolation period. We speak of being plagued by problems, using the disease's name metaphorically for any persistent trouble. The phrase, "avoid it like the plague," remains common, even among people who have never seen a case of plague. These linguistic fossils remind us that plague was once such a dominant feature of life that it shaped how people thought and spoke. Genetically, plague may have left its mark on human populations. Scientists have identified genetic variants that appear to confer some resistance to plague, and these variants are more common in populations descended from plague-affected regions. The gene that codes for the CCR5 protein, which some plague bacteria use to enter cells, has a variant that seems to provide protection. This variant is most common in European populations, suggesting that plague exerted strong selective pressure on European ancestry populations. This is evolution in action, plague killing those most susceptible and allowing those with protective variants to survive and reproduce. Perhaps most fundamentally, plague taught humanity about the interconnectedness of health and society. The disease respected no borders, acknowledged no social hierarchies, and revealed how the health of each individual affects the health of all. This lesson, learned painfully over centuries, underlies much of modern public health philosophy. We understand now that disease anywhere is potentially disease everywhere, that protecting public health requires collective action, and that we share a common vulnerability that transcends national, ethnic, or economic boundaries. These insights, forged in plague's fires, guide how we respond to health threats today. Plague in the 21st century exists in a curious state, simultaneously a disease of the past and a continuing present reality. Most people in developed countries think of plague as historical, something that belongs to medieval times, or perhaps to distant places they'll never visit. Yet the bacterium, Yersinia pestis, remains active in the world, causing thousands of cases each year, primarily in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Understanding where plague exists today, why it persists, and what risks it poses helps us appreciate both how far we've come and how vigilant we must remain. The geographic distribution of plague today reflects its ecology. The bacterium persists in what are called natural foci, regions where it circulates continuously in rodent populations without necessarily causing human disease. These foci exist on every inhabited continent except Australia. In the Americas, plague is found in the western United States, parts of South America including Peru, Bolivia and Brazil, and scattered locations in Central America. In Asia, it persists in Central Asian republics, parts of China, Mongolia and Southeast Asia. In Africa, the disease is most active in Madagascar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania and Uganda, though cases occur in other countries as well. Madagascar deserves special attention as it reports more plague cases than anywhere else in the world. Each year, typically during the rainy season from September to April, the country sees hundreds or even thousands of cases. The disease persists in rat populations in the Central Highlands, and transmission to humans occurs both through flea bites and, worryingly, through person-to-person transmission of pneumonic plague. Poverty, limited access to healthcare, and the challenges of reaching remote rural communities all contribute to Madagascar's ongoing plague problem. The country has developed expertise in rapid response to outbreaks, but resource constraints mean that prevention and control remain difficult. In the United States, plague persists primarily in prairie dog colonies and other rodent populations across the Southwest, particularly in New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California. The disease arrived in California during the third pandemic, establishing itself in ground squirrel populations, and then spread eastward through rodent-to-rodent transmission. Today, the United States sees an average of 7 human cases per year, most resulting from contact with infected animals during outdoor activities like hiking, camping, or hunting. Cats that hunt rodents can also contract plague and transmit it to their owners. These cases are almost always successfully treated, but they remind us that plague remains present in North America. Globally, the World Health Organization reports between 1,000 and 2,000 cases of plague annually, though the true number may be higher as some cases in remote areas likely go unreported. The case fatality rate varies widely depending on how quickly patients receive treatment. With prompt antibiotic therapy, mortality can be kept below 15% even for bubonic plague, and many patients recover completely. Without treatment, mortality rates remain above 50% for bubonic plague and approach 100% for pneumonic plague. The persistence of plague in animal populations means that complete eradication is effectively impossible with current technology. We would need to eliminate the bacterium from all its wildlife reservoirs across multiple continents, an enormous undertaking that would be ecologically disruptive and probably unachievable. Instead, the strategy is containment and rapid response. When cases occur, health authorities treat patients, trace contacts, and implement temporary rodent control measures in the affected area. This approach works reasonably well for preventing large outbreaks, but doesn't eliminate the underlying risk. Climate change introduces new uncertainties into plague ecology. As temperatures shift and rainfall patterns change, the geographic ranges of both rodents and fleas may expand or shift. Some models suggest that warming temperatures could make currently plague-free regions more suitable for plague transmission, while other regions might become less suitable. The relationship between climate and plague is complex, involving not just temperature, but also rainfall, humidity, vegetation patterns, and the ecology of multiple species. Scientists continue to study these relationships to better predict where plague might emerge in the future. Bioterrorism concerns have also kept plague on the radar of public health and security officials. Yersinia pestis has been classified as a potential bioterrorism agent because it can be grown in laboratories, because pneumonic plague can spread through the air, and because it causes severe disease. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union experimented with weaponizing plague, though both programs were supposedly discontinued. The knowledge that plague could potentially be used as a biological weapon means that public health systems maintain the capability to respond to unusual outbreaks that might indicate deliberate release. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2019, while caused by a virus rather than a bacterium, reminded the world of many lessons first learned through plague. The importance of rapid detection and reporting, the value of isolation and quarantine, the need for clear public communication, the challenges of balancing disease control with economic and social needs. All of these issues that seemed so urgent during COVID-19 were faced by societies dealing with plague centuries ago. The pandemic also demonstrated that despite all our modern technology, humanity remains vulnerable to emerging infectious diseases. One positive development from the COVID-19 pandemic has been increased investment in surveillance systems and rapid response capabilities for infectious diseases. These systems, designed to detect novel pathogens, also improve our ability to detect and respond to known threats like plague. Improved diagnostic technologies, better communication networks, and strengthened public health infrastructure all benefit plague control efforts, even though they weren't specifically developed for that purpose. Research into plague continues at universities and public health institutes around the world. Scientists study the bacterium's genetics to understand how it evolves and to monitor for antibiotic resistance. Ecologists investigate the factors that trigger outbreaks in animal populations and spill over into humans. Epidemiologists analyze patterns of human disease to identify risk factors and improve prevention strategies. Vaccine researchers work on developing more effective plague vaccines, as current vaccines are not widely used due to limited efficacy and side effects. This ongoing research ensures that our understanding of plague continues to deepen and that we maintain the capability to respond to changing circumstances. The story of plague in the modern era is thus one of successful management rather than complete victory. We have transformed plague from a civilization-threatening pandemic into a rare and usually treatable disease, but we have not eliminated it and likely cannot with current approaches. This requires us to maintain vigilance, to support public health systems, and to remember that the peace we enjoy from epidemic plague is not a permanent state, but an achievement that must be continuously maintained. As we reach the end of our journey through plague's history, it's worth reflecting on what this long story teaches us about humanity, about disease, and about our place in the natural world. The plague is not simply a tale of suffering and death, though it certainly includes those elements. It is also a story of resilience, of adaptation, of the gradual accumulation of knowledge, and of the ways that challenges, even terrible ones, can drive progress and change. The lessons we draw from plague's history remain relevant as we face current and future health challenges. perhaps the most fundamental lesson is about interconnectedness. Plague taught medieval people that they were connected to distant lands through trade routes, that disease in one place could become disease everywhere. This lesson has only become more relevant as our world has grown more interconnected. An infection that begins in a remote village can reach global cities within days. The health of animal populations affects human health. The choices made by individuals about seeking treatment or following public health guidance affect entire communities. We truly are all in this together, a truth that plague demonstrated centuries before we had the concepts to fully articulate it. Plague also teaches us about the importance of observation and questioning. For centuries, people accepted the humoral theory and miasma theory because these were what respected authorities taught. Progress came when individuals began to observe carefully, to question assumptions, and to test ideas through experimentation. Yersin's careful work identifying the plague bacterium, Simmons' experiments demonstrating flea transmission, the development of antibiotics through systematic research, all of these advances came from people who were willing to look closely at nature and to follow evidence rather than assumption. This scientific approach, this willingness to question and to test, remains our most powerful tool for understanding and addressing health challenges. The story of plague reminds us that progress is often incremental, and that solutions emerge from the accumulation of many small insights and advances. There was no single moment when humanity defeated plague. Instead, there were countless moments. The first quarantine measure, the first lazaretto, the first systematic surveillance, each urban improvement, each advance in understanding, each new antibiotic. These small steps, taken over centuries, added up to transformation. This is encouraging because it means that even small efforts matter, that progress doesn't require dramatic breakthroughs, and that persistent work toward better solutions pays off over time. We also learn about resilience. Societies that lost a third or half their population did not collapse entirely. They adapted, they rebuilt, they found new ways to organize themselves and to meet their needs. Individuals who lived through plague years found ways to continue their lives, to maintain hope, to create beauty and meaning even in the darkest times. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron during the plague year, creating art from catastrophe. Communities that were devastated eventually recovered, though changed. This resilience, this capacity to endure and to adapt, is one of humanity's most remarkable qualities. At the same time, plague's history includes cautionary lessons. The scapegoating and violence directed at Jewish communities during the Black Death reminds us that fear can bring out the worst in human nature. The tendency to blame others, to seek simple explanations for complex phenomena, to lash out at vulnerable groups during times of stress, these patterns have appeared again and again throughout history. Recognizing these patterns helps us guard against them and to respond to crises with compassion and rationality rather than fear and prejudice. The emergence of antibiotic resistance teaches us that our tools for fighting disease are not permanent solutions. Bacteria evolve, circumstances change, and we must continue to develop new approaches and to use existing tools wisely. The overuse of antibiotics in medicine and agriculture has contributed to the development of resistant bacteria, creating new challenges. This reminds us that short-term thinking can create long-term problems, and that we must consider the broader implications of our actions. Plague's persistence in the modern world, despite all our advances, is a reminder of humility. We have not conquered nature. We have not eliminated all threats. We share this planet with countless other organisms, including bacteria that can harm us, and we must remain vigilant. This is not cause for despair, but for realistic assessment. We have powerful tools, we have knowledge, we have systems in place, but we cannot become complacent. The price of health security is ongoing effort. Looking forward, the lessons of plague inform how we approach emerging infectious diseases. When new pathogens appear, as they inevitably will, we have frameworks for responding based on centuries of experience with plague. We know the value of rapid detection and reporting. We understand the importance of isolation and treatment. We recognize that clear communication and public cooperation are essential. We appreciate that international coordination is necessary because disease doesn't respect borders. These lessons, learned through plague, help us respond to new challenges more effectively. The relationship between human behavior and disease transmission is another enduring lesson. Plague spread because people traveled, because they lived in close proximity, because rats and fleas found human environments hospitable. Our behaviors matter. Where we live, how we manage our environments, how we interact with animals, these choices affect our disease risk. Understanding this empowers us to make choices that protect health while still allowing us to live full and connected lives. Finally, plague's history reminds us of the value of public health and collective action. The advances that have made plague manageable required not just scientific breakthroughs, but also social investments in public health infrastructure, in surveillance systems, in healthcare access, in sanitation and housing. These are collective goods that benefit everyone and that require collective effort to maintain. The relative peace we enjoy from epidemic disease today is not a natural state, but an achievement of organised society. And it's an achievement that each generation must choose to maintain and improve. As you drift towards sleep, consider that the world you inhabit is profoundly shaped by this long history. The public health systems that protect you, the antibiotics available when you need them, the sanitation and urban planning that reduce disease risk, the scientific understanding that guides medical care, all of these have roots in the struggle against plague. You are the beneficiary of centuries of hard-won knowledge and of the resilience of countless people who faced plague and survived, or who worked to understand and control it. Their efforts created a safer world, and now that world, with all its remaining challenges and possibilities, is yours to inhabit and to shape for those who come after. Rest well in the knowledge that while challenges remain, humanity has shown again and again its capacity to learn, to adapt, and to progress.